Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Kof Mem Tet 149. Ibaya Lehu, Shechi Mera Shehoda Mahu. We begin with a question regarding Shechi Mera. We already learned many times that someone who is on his deathbed, he has the ability to just declare that I want this field to go to A and that field to go to B, and even without any physical transaction that normally a healthy person would have to do some kind of act, the person on his deathbed, just by his words, is like a physical action, and as soon as he dies, then that field is automatically transferred to the person that he said he wants to give it to. Fine. That's if he says that I'm going to gift this or bequeath this to so-and-so. The question now is, what if he gives an admission? He says, this field actually belongs. I owe it to that person. Or this item here, this chair, I borrowed from Mr. B, and it's actually his. So it's not that he's now saying I'm going to give it to him. He's saying that actually this belongs to that person all along. I borrowed it from him, and really it belongs to him. Now it could be that it actually doesn't. Right? What if it really doesn't belong to him? By the Shechi Mera, by saying, oh, this belongs to him, I'm admitting that I owe him this money or this item. Is that sufficient to actually transfer the item, assuming that it's actually not true that if it really does belong to that person, then fine, the guy can go just pick it up. But let's say it doesn't belong to him, and instead of using a language of a gift or bequeathment as an inheritance, instead, he uses a language of, I admit that it's his. That's the question, and we have an answer from a story. Tashema. Di'isur giura hava le teresa alfe zuze be'rava. There was a man named Isur, interesting name. He was a convert, and he had 12,000 dinar that he deposited in Rava's house. He told Rava, hold on to this. He didn't give it to him as a gift. He was going to get it back eventually. And then Isur died. Now, Isur has a son, Rav Mari, Bere. Rav Mari, one of the great sages, was his son. Horata shelo bikdusha, veledato bikdusha havai, ube Rav hava. Now, Isur had this son, Rav Mari, before he was conceived, before his conversion, although his wife gave birth to him after he converted. In other words, his mother's Jewish, this Rav Mari. His mother actually is a daughter of the Amora Shemuel, so a great lineage. The daughters of Shemuel apparently were abducted or something, and in the end, she somehow got together with this non-Jew. Now, she became pregnant while Isur was not Jewish. And so therefore, Rab Mari is Jewish, 100%, because his mother's Jewish. There's no problem with that. The question is, who is his father? So his biological father is clearly Isur. However, because he converted only afterwards, but at the time of conception he was not Jewish, therefore, legally, from a halachic point of view, Rab Mari is not his father, and therefore what does not automatically inherit him. So that's the complication in this case. And now, when Rab Mari was on his deathbed, when Isur was on his deathbed, Rab Mari was not there. He was in the Bet HaMidrash. He was not present there. We'll see why that is relevant in a second. Amar Rava, Hechi nikninu Rab Mari lehanezuzeh. Now Rava, who is holding on to this 12,000 dinar, he wants to keep it for himself. And this is the law, that if someone converts and they have no biological children after they convert, then anyone who comes and takes their property first can keep it, right? It's all hefker. If someone converts and has children after they convert, then those children are born Jewish. If they're conceived while the father is Jewish, then they have the regular law of any Jew, and then that son would inherit. The complication here is that Rab Mari is not the halachic legal son of Isur, his father. So Rava says, Isur has no legal relatives, and therefore I'm going to keep it. After all, how and what mechanism would Rab Mari have been able to acquire it? Let's go through all the options. Ibirusha la bar Yerushahu. Can Rab Mari inherit from Isur, his father? No, because he is not fit to inherit from Isur, because he was not Jewish when he conceived his child and only converted later. So although it's his biological father, it's not his halachically legal father. Ibe matana matanat shechi mera kirusha shavyu harabanan. Kol echad ita birusha ite bematana. Kol echad le'eta birusha le'ete bematana. Is it that Isur on his deathbed said, I want to give it as a gift to my son? Is it possible? And even if he said that, would it work? It wouldn't work. Why? Because the gift of a shechi mera is like an inheritance. The rabbis treated it like an inheritance. And therefore, only someone who can bequeath can give a gift. Someone who cannot bequeath, who's not within the law of inheritance, and that's true for Isur because he has no legal relatives. He converted, and he didn't have any children after he converted, and so therefore he cannot bequeath anything to anyone. And since he cannot bequeath, he also cannot give anyone something as a gift through matanat shechi mera. You can give a regular gift, but a regular gift that you give while you're alive and healthy, that requires some kind of act of transfer. You have to do something. And so here, the law of matanat shechi mera does not work for him because he cannot bequeath any inheritance to any person. If did he acquire it by pulling, right? Did he pick something up? It can't be because Rav Mari was not present there at the deathbed, so he could not have done such an action. Did he do a symbolic exchange? A symbolic exchange, possibly Isur could have done that on his deathbed with something else, right? Someone would give him a handkerchief and representing Rav Mari, and then Isur, by accepting the handkerchief, would say, I'm giving over to Rav Mari this item. Did he do it by Chalipin? Cannot be that because coins cannot be acquired by means of chalipin. You can only acquire items through chalipin, a piece of furniture or something like that, but you cannot acquire currency through chalipin. Doesn't work. Maybe did it by means of land. Generally, if I give you land, then I could say, listen, as I transfer this land, I also want you to acquire some furniture and some coins and whatever else. That would work if you have land. But Isur did not own any land, so he can't be, he did it with kinyan agav. We saw earlier that there is something called Ma'amad Sheloshtan. If three parties are all together, the giver, the recipient, and the guy who's holding on to it now, which is Rava. See, Rava is holding on to the money. He has to give the money back to Isur. So if they're all three are present there, then Isur could tell Rava, listen, that 12,000 dinar that you're supposed to give back to me, instead of giving it back to me, I want you to give it to Rav Mari, my biological son. If all three were present, then that would work. You could do that just with words. But Rava says, I was not present. Also, we know Rav Mari wasn't present. And Rava is saying further, even if they asked me to come, I wouldn't come. Why would I do that? Then I lose out on the 12,000 dinar that I'm holding. So therefore, I'm going to stay home and not go so that you cannot do Ma'amad Sheloshtan. So I certainly wasn't there. And so therefore, look, we've exhausted all of the possible ways of making a transaction. And you see that this 12,000 dinar that I have, I am keeping because there was no legal way for Isur to transfer this to Rav Mari. But then, luckily, to save the day, Matkif la Rav Ika bered Rav Ameh. Amai, velode Isur de halin zuzeh de Rav Mari ninhu, velikninhu beodita. Rav Ika, the son of Rav Ameh, says, wait, why are you saying that, Rav Mari, there's no way for him to acquire it? Isur, on his deathbed, could admit that these coins belong to Rav Mari, and then he will acquire it through that admission. So there is a legal mechanism, and could very well be that Isur on his deathbed said, I am making an admission. I owe Rav Mari 12,000 dinar. These coins belong to him. And so by making admission, it would go to him. And that suggestion was correct. In the meantime, while they're discussing this, sure enough, an admission was announced from the house of Isur that said Isur admitted that he owes this money, these 12,000 dinar, belong to Rav Mari. And so that's a legal mechanism by which Rav Mari can acquire it from Isur on his deathbed. Ikpad Rabba Amar ka migmere ta'anata li'inashe umifsedi li. Rava got upset and he said, look, they're teaching people legal claims and causing me a loss. Generally, if someone comes into court, we let them speak for themselves. Here's what happened, here's what I did. The judges and the sages should not feed litigants ways of getting around the law. And so Rava, maybe he himself knew that this is a possibility, but he's making a claim in court and saying, look, there was no possibility. And then all of a sudden, Ravika, the son of Rav Ameh, says, oh no, wait, there is a loophole. There is a way that even someone in this case can transfer money, and that would be through admission. And so because he said that, so they learned that, and then they applied that, and Rava got upset that, look, these sages, they're teaching people had to make a legal claim that they wouldn't have known themselves, and now I lost money because of that. All right, it's a fun story, and the point of this whole story is that, yes, in fact, admission works. This answers our original question. If someone on his deathbed said, I owe this money to so-and-so, even if actually they didn't owe it before, but just by saying that, we take that as a legal transfer, and thereby, when the person dies, that money actually goes to the person who he said he owes it to. Next part of the Mishnah, Shied karka kol shehu matenato kayemet. The Mishnah said that if someone on his deathbed said, I'm giving away most of my property, and he gives it away, divvies it up, but he keeps for himself karka kol shehu, land, even a tiny bit of land, he keeps for himself, and then he gets better, he cannot reclaim all the land that he gave away, because we assume, since he kept a little bit for himself, why is he keeping any for himself if he really thinks he's going to die? That means he actually had in mind that he wants to give gifts. He was generous at this point, and he's giving all the stuff away permanently. And if he gets better, he only keeps the little bit of land that he didn't give away, and he cannot take back the rest of it. So now we ask, V'chama kol shehu, when you say a little bit, how much? Like, 1 inch by 1 inch, is that sufficient? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, karka kedei parnasato, v'Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar, metaltelin kedei parnasato. So Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, if it's land, it has to be enough for his livelihood, not little 1 inch of land, has to be enough that will produce whatever grain or fruit that he can live on. He can eat and sell and get everything that he needs for his basic sustenance. It has to be sufficient for that. If it's less than that, well, what was he thinking? What I'm gonna if I get better, then how are you going to live on just a tiny piece of land? It means he kept enough for himself that he could live, and if he gets better, then yes, you can assume that the rest of it he gave away as a final gift. And yet Rav Yirmiyah, the son of Abba, says it doesn't have to necessarily be land. What if he kept for himself movable property sufficient for his livelihood? Right? He kept some goods that he could use or sell or cash, and it's enough for his livelihood. Then same thing. We can assume that everything that he gave away, he wanted to give away permanently, and he kept enough for his livelihood. So that's all. Amar Rabbi Zera, kama mechavenan shema'atata desabeh. Rabbi Zera says, look how meticulous, look how carefully thought out are the words of these of our elders, these two sages. Karka ta'amamai di'ika samich aleh, metatelename ki ikae samich alaihu. Look how they're thought through, right? What's the reason why if you keep some land, then we assume that the rest of it is a gift, because he's relying on that land. But that would only make sense if there's sufficient land for a livelihood. So this really makes sense that when it says kol shehu, it means enough, just enough for his livelihood. But since that's the reason for it, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be land. The Mishnah is just giving an example. For example, he kept land. But what if he kept movable items, but it's the same amount? an amount sufficient for his livelihood, then he's relying on that for his livelihood, and he really means to give everything else away as a permanent gift. So you see, it really makes sense what they said. Matkif la Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef disagrees with Rabbi Zera. Umay chavanta man de'amar mitaltelin karkatenan man de'amar kedeh parnasato kol shehu tenan. So what do you mean? Look how meticulous, look how thoughtful are their words. Actually, their explanation doesn't fit with the words of the Mishnah. The second opinion of Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, who says movable items, that doesn't fit with the Mishnah that says karka. So why say karka if it means anything? And the first opinion of Rav Yehuda Amarav, who said sufficient for his livelihood, that's not what it says in the Mishnah. Mishnah says kol shehu. Why would the Mishnah write kol shehu if it really means kedeh parnasato? So actually the words do not fit well with the language of the Mishnah. So why are you saying that they are so meticulously thought out? Abaye now comes to answer Rav Yosef's question and defend Rabbi Zera. Is that true that whenever we see the word karka in a Mishnah, it means only land and it cannot refer also to movable items? V'hatanan. Here's an example where the word karka, which means land, is going to be not particularly land. It will refer also to movable items. Here's the Mishnah in Pe'ah 3:8. If someone says, I want to give all of my property to this Eved Kanaani, the Eved Kanaani goes free because included with that gift, he's giving everything, is himself. Because he is owned by this master, so the master, by telling him, you own everything, that means he owns himself now, so he gains his freedom. However, Shi'er karka kol shehu lo yaseh ben chorin. If the master says, I'm giving everything to you, my Eved Kanani, except for this small piece of land, then he does not go free. Why? Because when you say except for a piece of land, that might refer to the Eved Kanani himself. Although an Eved Kanani is not literally land, however, for many laws, the law of a slave is equivalent to the law of land. And therefore, the word karka can refer to an Eved Kanani. We didn't yet learn that it can refer to metalti and to movable items, but that's coming up. Rabbi Shimon Omer, L'olamu ben chorin ad shiomar, kol nechasai netunim liploni abdi chutz me'achad miribo shebahen. Rabbi Shimon says, if you say, I'm giving you everything except for land, then what he's keeping for himself is only land, and therefore, the Eved Kanani does get himself free. So Rabbi Shimon disagrees with that case. However, he would say that it does not go free in the following case if the master says, I'm giving you everything except 1/10,000th of what I own. Now he doesn't specify which 1/10,000th. Is it this cup? Is it that tray? Is it some chair? Which 1/10,000th? Maybe a piece of land. So since he doesn't say, it could be that he has in mind to withhold for himself the value of the slave. The slave, if he's very rich, maybe the slave is in fact 1/10,000th, or it's an expression to demean the slaves, except for this little bit. I'll give you everything, but not you yourself. Okay, so since that can refer to the slave does not go free. That's the end of the Mishnah, but here's the proof. V'amar Rav Dimi bar Yosef amar Rabbi Elazar, asu metaltelin shiyur esel ayebed, velo asu metaltelin shiyur esel ketubah. Rav Dimi, the son of Yosef, said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, that the rabbis made movable items a withholding regarding a slave. In other words, he's adding to the Mishnah, and that, let's say someone says, I'm giving you, my Eved Kanani, I'm giving you all my property except for some movable item. In that case, he's withholding for himself a movable item. That means he withholds for himself also the slave. The slave does not go free in that case, because the slave, in a sense, is also a movable item. In some ways he's like land, in some ways he's a movable item. This is the proof. What we see here is that even though the Mishnah gave a case of Chachamim in the Mishnah, said a case of Shier Karka Kol Shehu, if the master withheld a little piece of land, then the slave doesn't go free because the slave might be included in that piece of land that he keeps for himself. This is not necessarily only for Karka. That applies also to metaltalin. If he says, I'm giving you everything except for some small amount of movable items, then he keeps the slave for himself because the slave might be included in movable items. Why the Mishnah say karka? We'll see in a second, but the point is that karka does not mean necessarily only karka. Karka can refer to a movable item also. And so therefore, this is the answer of Abaye to Rav Yosef, and to explain at least half of the question that we asked. Yes, when it says over here that not only karka, also metaltalin, doesn't have to be only something that's land, could be movable items also. Well, and you asked, well, that doesn't fit with the language of the Mishnah. So I say it does fit with the language. When the Mishnah says karka, that's an example, but it can include also movable items. Now, we have to finish off what Rabbi Elazar said. He also said that the sages did not consider a movable item a withholding regarding a ketubah. Regarding a ketubah, the husband has to pay a certain amount, 200 zuz, to his wife at the end of the marriage. However, let's say he gives her a piece of land. He sees the husband is dividing up his stuff before he dies, and he says, okay, sons, you get all this land. My wife, she gets this piece of land. If the wife doesn't say anything, then she gets the piece of land only, and she cannot collect her ketubah, because that piece of land, we assume, is instead of the ketubah. If she wanted something else, in addition to that, she needed to say something. And so, by withholding a piece of land to give to his wife, that's instead of the ketubah. Fine. What if he withholds some movable item? He says, I'm giving everything to my children except this chair. This chair goes to my wife. And she didn't say anything. Does that mean she cannot collect the ketubah? No. Lo asumataltin shiur. Withholding a movable item is not considered leaving something out such that that's a replacement for the ketubah. So you see that withholding a metaltalin applies differently for an eved as for a ketubah. And so now we have an answer to Rav Yosef's challenge. However, Rav Yosef is going to say, no, that case, that example that you bring from Peah is different. Hatam bedinhu dela litne karka. Vaydi detana resha, Rabbi Akiva omer karka, kol shu chayvet bepeah bikurim. V'lichtob alem piroz bol. V'liknot emahem nechasim, she'en lahem achariyut b'chesed b'shtar b'chazaka, mishum achi katane karka. Says, no, in that Mishnah, really, you're right. The Mishnah should not have written karka, because the same applies to anything. And if the master says to his slave, I'm giving you everything except for something, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be land or metaltalin. So really, in that Mishnah, it should not have said karka. Why does it say karka in that Mishnah? Because just continuing the language from the previous Mishnah. We just read 3.8. In Peah 3.6, it says as follows. Rabbi Akiva says, even a small amount of land, you have to give pe'ah and bikurim. You only own a little piece of land, and you grow something on it, you still have to leave a corner, and you still have to bring bikurim. You can't say, well, it's so small. So you see, this law of Rabbi Akiva applies only, obviously, to karka. You only have to give pe'ah and bikurim to something that grows on land. And furthermore, he has more laws regarding a little piece of land. You can write a piros bol, even if you only own a little piece of land. The law of piros bol is that the person that owes money has to own a little piece of land in order for the collector to be able to write a piros bol, right? If you owe me money and we're going to have Shivit is going to come and I want to write a piros bol, it's important that you own a piece of land. How big? Even a tiny piece of land is enough for to make a piros bol able to be written. And also, even a tiny piece of land you can use for kinyan agav. Let's say I'm selling you a tiny piece of land, and I do that with kesef, shtar, or b'chazaka. That's the ways. Those are 3 ways to acquire land. Or I'm giving you this, and you either pay me or you give me a deed. or you do something to the land to show your ownership over it. You work the land or lock it. In all those cases, I can sell along with this little tiny piece of land items that you cannot use as a guarantee, meaning movable items. So even if I'm just giving you a tiny piece of land, I can say along with this tiny piece of land, you get this whole warehouse full of fruits. So that's the end of the Mishnah of Rabbi Akiva. So because this previous Mishnah talked about land specifically and used the word karka, so now the Mishnah continues saying, oh listen, I'll just use the word land again, even though technically this halacha would apply to land and metaltalin. But you can't bring that as a proof for here. Over there, you're right, it really could have said anything. It uses karka because of the flow of the language from the previous Mishnah. But here, if it says karka kolshehu, it didn't mention anything about karka before in the previous Mishnah, and therefore if it meant anything, it should have said anything. If it says karka, it means only karka. Next, we quote what Abaye says against Rav Yosef's question regarding the word kol shehu. Right? Rav Yosef said, wait, why are you saying the elders are so great? Because they said kol shehu means kedeh parnasato, enough for his livelihood. That's not a very meticulous reading. Kol shehu means literally even a tiny bit. So this is not a proper reading. You should interpret kol shehu to mean only a tiny little bit. Abaye challenges Rav Yosef and answers his question, and he says, is that true that every time you see the word kol shehu, there's no limit? It means even one speck? V'hatenan, Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas omer, chamesh rechelot gozezot, mane uperas, hayavot bereshit hagez. Hachamim omrim, chamesh rechelot gozezot kol shehen. This Mishnah is from Masechet Holin, and is talking about the first shearing of wool from sheep has to be donated to a kohen. Now, this does not apply if you're only shearing one sheep, you only own one sheep, then you don't have to give anything. There's a minimum amount, kind of like challah. Only if you're making a big dough, then you have to take a piece and give it to the kohen. So, where there's an argument about what is the minimum amount of shearing that one has to give to the kohen. Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas says it has to be that there are 5 sheep, and from each one you're shearing a 100 and a half of 100, meaning 150 dinar. Then the mitzvah kicks in, but that's the minimum. It's relatively high. Then you have to give it a shitagez. Hachamim say no. I agree that it has to be 5 sheep, but even if it's kol shehen, even a tiny amount of shearing from each sheep, that is required to give to the kohen. Now, regarding that Mishnah, we said, V'amrinan, kama kol shehen, amarav, maneh uperas, ubilbad sheyehem mechumashot. What do you mean kol shehen when the Chachamim say? Even what? 5 hairs, one from each one? No, that's not sufficient. Rav says it has to be altogether 150 dinar between the 5 sheep, as long as they are equally divided. So you see here that Rav thinks that kol shehen doesn't mean literally a tiny bit. It means less than what the Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas says. But even a kol shehen means some minimum. And so here too, Abaye says, kol shehen in the Mishnah can very well mean that he keeps for himself enough land for his sustenance. That's when he doesn't have to give that's when he cannot take the rest of the gifts back, because he kept for himself a little bit of land, enough for sustenance. But if he had kept for himself only a very tiny piece of land, well, that's not enough for sustenance. Well, in that case, he would be able to get all the other land back that he gave on his deathbed. So Rav Yosef has an answer. Hatam bedinu deladitne kol shehu. Really, in that case of the Mishnah, it should not have written kol shehu here, kol shehen. It should have written chamesh rechelot gozizot, and it should have given the minimum amount, right, if it adds up to 150. So why did it say kol shehu? It's only stylistic. Da'idit dekamar tana kama shiura rabba v'amar ihu name shiura zutra karila kol shehu. It's only by contrast to Tanakama, Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas, because he said a very big amount, and so this amount is very small compared to that, so that's why it's called, in comparison, just a little bit, because it's compared to something that was 5 times as much. So that's why I said kol shehu, just to show the contrast between the large amount of Tanakama and the small amount here. However, in our Mishnah, where it's not talking, there's no other opinion. That we're comparing it to, who says has to be a big amount, that you would call this a kol shehu, a tiny amount. Therefore, this Mishnah has no stylistic excuse to write kol shehu. Rav Yosef says. Therefore, if this Mishnah says kol shehu, it means literally kol shehu, even the tiniest bit. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.